Welcome to Step Into the Pivot. We're your hosts. I'm Teresa Conti.
And I'm Ivana Polonio. We talk with people just like you. We have honest conversations about current issues that women and men face and how we pivot to address them in our lives.
This podcast is your companion as you step into a workout or take some time for yourself.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Step Into the Pivot. I am super excited to have Ami Hindia with us today. So Ami has been in the retirement industry for over 20 years, working with Fidelity's workplace investing group. She works with, plan advisors, plan sponsors, but really, to me, she's a leader. She's really supporting a team whose focus is building advisor and TPA relationships. And that's just such an amazing thing. I love the word leader. So I love having you here, Ami. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor and pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Ami. This is Ivana here recording from Croatia. I'm sitting on my parents' sofa. And if our audio sounds a little more rustic today, I am in quite an urban environment, but there might be some might sound a little different, and that is because I am very far away from my original desk, but I'm also very close to the location where a lot of my own pivots took place. And those of you who checked out, and if you didn't, you should, some of our earlier episodes, you heard me talk about playing the pivot bingo, and then Teresa was asking me about my pivots and a number of pivots, and I'm really excited to play pivot bingo right now with Ami. Ami, when we were preparing for this recording, you were so bravely and vulnerably highlighting that you've been through a lot and that there are a lot of things you could share with our listeners and our watchers. Those of you watching us on our YouTube channel can see actually my parents' sofa and the art that I don't know that I was ever completely in support of, but it's still here many years later, just like our pivots stay in our system many years later. So Ami, I'm going to bring up the pivots that you had highlighted for us and kind of very express style. Tell us the whole thing, basically what it is, what's that pivot for you, and lesson learned. And then we're going to do that a few times, and then we'll start to zoom in on one particular one that you think that will be really special for our audience. You ready?
I'm ready. Go for it.
Okay. Overcoming breast cancer.
So I was diagnosed with stage 0 breast cancer back in 2021. It was the same year I had my third child. It was right after I had her, actually. And it was at that point that I started to take my health seriously, and realize that life is it's just too short. And I had to let the small stuff go and realize that I had to prioritize my life.
Okay. I'm going to practice right now, not diving deeper. That's not easy for me. I'm going to pivot from my normal style of communicating, and we're going to move on to the second one. Transitioning from an individual contributor to a leader.
Oh, yes. I went from being a wholesaler to being a leader of wholesalers. And so it was this transition in my life where I went from seeing my name in lights, getting recognition, which was a huge factor that motivated me in my career, to seeing my team members' names in lights and becoming their servant leader. And what I mean by that is I'm here to serve them now, to see them shine. And it's been an honor and a pleasure to do that, to create an amazing group of wholesalers that I am proud to, again, see when they get recognized. And it's no longer about me, it's about them.
So question number 3 in the pivot bingo, tell us about imposter syndrome.
I've been given the opportunity to be in leadership, and yet I always second guess myself. And I don't know why. There's so many that look up to me, and I still wonder why sometimes. Do I belong here? I think we all have a little bit of that inside of us. I appreciate that others saw something in me that I didn't see in myself to be put into the position that I'm in today. I'm always going to have a little voice in the back of my head saying, do I belong here? And I should remind myself, I absolutely do belong here.
Wow. Soundbite.
Mic drop. No, I'm kidding.
Tell us about code switching because I really wasn't that familiar with that term when you brought that to us, but it's totally true. A lot of us have it. So talk to us about that.
Absolutely. This is a topic that I truly haven't discussed at all in my life or in my career until a few months ago. Code switching wasn't even a term that I was familiar with until recently. So I appreciate your comments there. By definition, it's the ways in which a member from an underrepresented group consciously or unconsciously adjust their language, their syntax, their grammatical structure, their behavior, or even their appearance sometimes in order to fit into the dominant culture. And for me, it had largely to do with behavior to fit in.
And when you talk about behavior, what do you mean by behavior?
So, I think we're all inherently wired in terms of how we present ourselves in current state. And I think that for me, a lot of code switching started for me early in my life. And I didn't, again, realize this term until recently, but it had a really profound impact with me just from the start of my life.
Okay, so tell us more about that. And really like going back on what we were playing with the pivoting and the,
Mhm.
the impact. Tell us about the impact of code switching as a pivot on your life growing up.
Absolutely. So, some of my earliest memories are me learning to speak and learning my Indian language. I was born in this country, but I learned my language first because my mom taught me our language at home. And then it was time for preschool and I had to learn English. And I distinctly remember three questions that my parents taught me that are on audio tape somewhere at my parents' house today. The questions were, what is your name? How old are you? And how are you? And I remember them saying, what is your name? And I'd be like, fine. How old are you? Ami, you get it. But I definitely had to learn English going into school. And I have fond memories of my mom and I watching Sesame Street and all my children to learn English. Seriously, like I can attribute our learning of English to Big Bird and Susan Lucci. But anyways, I learned in preschool that I was different when I spoke. And when I spoke, no one understood me. So naturally, I did whatever it took to acclimate to the other kids, right? So year after year, grade after grade. But what I was reminded early on by my parents was we came to this country for a better life, better opportunities, and a good education. Great. You can be American out there, but you're Indian at home. And I had to abide by my parents' cultural habits and rules. And so I had to navigate my parents' expectations of a good Indian daughter at home. So, for example, you can have an opinion out there, raise your hand in class, but at home, what dad says goes, not your opinion. You can challenge the status quo out there. At home, you can't. And that was hard for me to navigate because I was thinking to myself, like, how could I be one way at home and one way at school? And I never knew I lived essentially two lives until I heard the term code switching. And I don't know any other way, right? Like, even to this day, I represent everything my parents wanted to raise me as. I'm a strong, independent, financially capable, successful woman with a career, right? But regardless of what I do or my title, at home, I am still my parents' daughter. And so I'm expected to make sure lunch is waiting for my parents when they visit my home. And I still can't challenge my father's thinking. As a little girl, I wish I had someone like an ally to help me navigate my two personas, or at least help me normalize it.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing because, I think we all have that in some way, shape, form in our lives, right? You don't even realize it, right? Maybe you realized it more because it was so evident, but I think we all in some ways have that. And what I'd like to talk to you about now is about your career. Like, because clearly, right, when you were in school, this was happening. But when you transitioned to a career, I can't even imagine how difficult that must have been having those two different personas.
When it comes to my career, talking about my upbringing was something that I talked about and joked about with honestly my Indian friends because we all went through something similar with our upbringings. Discussing it with anyone else really never happened. Discussing it, I didn't discuss it not because I was embarrassed or anything like that. I think it's just something that I felt no one would understand or frankly care. And as I started my career, I didn't want to stand out. I wanted to blend in, right? So to stay neutral, I conformed. And it took me many years to find my voice. At home, I wasn't allowed to speak up. I couldn't talk against my father's beliefs. In my career, I had to speak up. I was petrified initially because that wasn't how I was wired, because of just my upbringing. So as a former wholesaler, I had to learn to find my voice and be heard, because after all, that was my job, right? And I struggled with that for quite some time until ultimately I embodied it, because that's what the role entailed.
I mean, some of our listeners might not be familiar with the culture of that is, a part of wholesaler role,
Mhm.
lifestyle of a
Sure.
wholesaler. Can you just highlight, and I think this will be really interesting even for those of you who are listening who are wholesalers, what are, from your standpoint, some of the key characteristics that are required, in a comfort level with, certain attributes of that role in order for a person to thrive when performing it.
Absolutely. So fundamentally, as a wholesaler, you're in sales, right? So, and you're also, for me, I never thought of myself as a salesperson. I thought of myself as a relationship manager, because at the end of the day, I wasn't selling the name on my business card as much as I was selling myself. And so as a wholesaler, I was in meetings, right, where I would meet with a group or an individual one-on-one and try to convey why it would make sense to work with me. And so a lot of times you'd have someone that would challenge you back, right? And I had to find my voice to say, it's okay to say, maybe what you're thinking isn't the way to think. Maybe there's a different way of thinking. And I had to find that voice, and with just interactions like that, to say, here's how I would challenge that. Because again, I couldn't challenge at home. And then obviously, as a wholesaler, you present a lot, to different audiences and whatnot, and you are the talking figure. People are there to hear what you have to say, and to have that powerful presence in a room, where before I never felt that way. I had to find myself in that role, or in that mode, and feel comfortable being in that mode. And so wholesaling, a lot of it, I would say 90% of that, if not more, is communication. And so communicating to someone else to have them change a decision, make a decision, is very powerful. And so that's something that took me time to find my comfortability, to be an authoritative figure, whether it be in a group setting or a one-on-one setting, to say, here's what I have to say, and here's why it matters, and here's why maybe what you're thinking is great, or maybe here's why I challenge you to think differently.
Mhm. And then if you take that further and you expand into leadership role, so can you help us connect the dots between, what you talked about, the upbringing, code switching in general, and then this whole, being really attuned to the attributes of being in a sales slash, leading that towards service? Because you're talking a lot about service also, that whole thing about like selling and what you're really selling from the heart and with authenticity. I know we've talked about that a lot. Can you help us connect that with leadership?
Absolutely. So, as a wholesaler, you're visible. And trust me, when you're in leadership, you're even more visible, right? So, I'm in a highly visible role within my organization, and people want to hear from me internally and externally. So, it took me a long time to feel comfortable in speaking up, as I mentioned earlier, and I've been doing it a long time. And in this role, what I came to realize, and I've been in this role for only 2.5 years, I have a different kind of obligation. I have the opportunity to showcase a strong level of representation, representation for women and representation for the underrepresented. So I've come to realize that my voice matters in a different way. So again, it took me a long time to get here, but when I had the chance to discuss my background, the amount of folks that have approached me afterwards to say, thanks for making me feel seen. Thanks for making me feel heard. You represent someone like me. That's powerful. And this is a very hard topic to talk about, because you feel incredibly vulnerable, but others thank you because they finally see representation in discussing a topic that they also never brought up in a work setting. And that's huge. I have the chance to help people embrace their authentic selves and not be embarrassed or hide from the fact that they might lead two different personas. And that is important and so powerful to address.
I really love that authenticity. We've talked about that before. And I think it is so important, right? To be authentic, to be who you are, because if you try to be somebody else, people see through that and you don't come across as who you want to come across, right? And how you want to come across and who you want to be and who you really are. I mean, I think that says so much about you, and I think that, sometimes it is hard to share those things in a corporate setting, in a business world setting. I've talked about that as far as my breast cancer goes. I was afraid to talk about that for many, many years, right? So it makes sense to me that this is something maybe that you didn't want to highlight about yourself, but it is part of who you are, and it is part of how you want to be seen by others. And I think it's nothing to be, that you should be ashamed of. It clearly is, right?
Yep. And it's interesting you say that about the breast cancer. Like, to be honest, when I was wholesaling, at a certain point I decided to tell people because and it was partly because I was going through so much that I didn't want to like skip a beat and make people wonder why I maybe fell off because it was what I was thinking about, even if I was at the meeting. But what I realized, Teresa, is when I brought it up, just like I'm bringing this up today, it humanizes us. Like, yeah, I'm a wholesaler or I'm a leader. We are so much more than what we do. And so I think it makes people realize that, wow, like maybe I'm just taking a meeting here, but didn't realize that this person has other things going on behind the scenes. And so I think this is a good way to humanize that what we do probably outside of our roles is probably far more important than what we do, on the day to day.
Yeah, and when you just said that, even and I both reacted because it's true. You don't know what's going on in somebody else's life or what they've been through or what has happened with them, right? Even, I mean, I think you would say the same thing. I saw us both react at the
Yeah.
exact same time. So I knew that
Mhm.
she was onto something there.
Absolutely. This is so important, and it just makes such a difference in how things go in the world of business. If we can find that attunement and really be there for ourselves and with ourselves, and then open to the other person with just this curiosity and awareness, there might be a lot more going on for this person. And it may be good, it may be bad, it may be everything in between, it may be both. You might be having a day like you were talking about, you had just had your daughter when you had the news, right? So it's like I could see you going from having one of the most like miraculous experiences and just looking upon this baby and being all filled with awe and oh my goodness, life is so good. And then fear comes up and so like it's
Oh yeah.
everything,
It's all the emotions.
right? Yeah.
Hmm.
I wanted to highlight what you were talking about, the little preschooler who is mix and matching answers in the question. And I just, I know that you were talking about that in a different context. I also just love what that little girl was doing there, like teaching all of us that, yes, you know what? Sometimes these questions and answers, they start to get jumbled up. Life jumbles them up. We should maybe be jumbling them up a little bit more than just working with the labels. How are you? I'm Ami.
I know, right? You just memorize the answers, you roll with it until you figure it out. But that kind of is how this was with code switching too, right? Like I think whether Teresa and I were talking about this earlier, it's not a cultural thing. I think it's everyone to a certain extent, no matter who you are and what your background is, everyone has a kind of code switching in their lives, right? Like we are a certain way at work, we're a certain way at home. But some people have it differently than others. And it's just, I think for us, when we talk about being our authentic selves, making someone feel authentic is by learning more about them. And maybe not everyone wants to share their details, and that's totally fine. But if someone is ready to share what their background's about, I would tell anyone that's listening to this to be open and be receptive to what information they're willing to share with you in order to help you understand that individual better, personally and professionally. I think that helps with relationships on both levels.
So the final question we always ask our guests is, how was this pivot for you a step forward, especially as we're talking about code switching? Is there something else that you would say? I love what you just said about, sharing and knowing people. So is there something else that you would point out there?
Yeah, I think this code switching was the step into my pivot. And I love the your podcast name. I think it's perfect. But it is stepping into my pivot. And what I mean by that is I'm not alone in the way that I feel or how I've had to represent myself my whole life. I'm very proud to have my Indian culture, and I've never felt more like my authentic self than when I started embracing that I am different and that I'm okay with it. And that's really as of recently, like probably in the last 2 years or so, is really where I've started to feel like my authentic self. But that comes over time, right? I couldn't imagine my 20-year-old self feeling as comfortable as I feel now. But that goes for a lot of things, right? We all feel more comfortable with ourselves as we get older. But I think the fact that being in my role, I think inspires others who are underrepresented, that I understand them, that I get it, and that it's okay to be your authentic self. And that's where I feel like I've stepped into my pivot.
Yes, and if you feel compelled or inspired by some of these stories to share your own, connect with us, contact us, let us know. And perhaps you can join brave folks like Ami in sharing your story. Thank you, Ami, so much for talking about consistency, of being authentic, consistency of authenticity, even in the face of code switching.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
Thank
so
you for
much.
having me.
Amazing. I loved everything you had to say. I think it says so much to me, to even to our audience. So I really want to thank you, Ami, for being here today and joining us and telling your story. And we will have you back to talk about one of your other pivots for sure. We would love to have you back. So for me, I just want to remind our listeners, if you have a pivot, step into it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Step Into the Pivot. We hope you found inspiration and valuable insights from our conversation. Remember, life is a series of pivots, and it's in those moments of change that we truly grow.
If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay connected, make sure to check out our websites. You'll find additional resources, behind-the-scenes content, and more details about our incredible guests. We love hearing from listeners, so reach out with your thoughts, questions, or your own pivot stories.
To keep the conversation going, be sure to follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn and Instagram, where we share updates, quotes, and engage with our amazing community.
If you haven't already, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your feedback makes a difference, and it helps us bring you meaningful conversations. We're signing off, reminding you that every pivot is a step forward. Take care, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Step Into the Pivot.